Hey everybody. Sorry I couldn't come to campus today. Woke up feeling pretty bad, and so I didn't want to risk exposing anybody, getting anybody sick. But feeling better, so hopefully should be fine for class on Thursday. But in place of today's class, I don't want you to have to do much work, but I didn't want us to get behind in class. And so what I'm going to do in this video is just kind of briefly go over what we were going to do first in today's class, and then I'm going to set up the activity we were going to do, and then we'll just pick up with that on Thursday. But something that we haven't talked about yet in class, because remember, we're in the section on mental health and incarceration, right? What does it look like to have a diagnosable mental health issue within carceral facilities? But we haven't done much work on intersectionality within this realm. And so this is going to be the first time we do that within the carceral space. And we're particularly going to look at incarcerated women and the unique challenges that they face. And the reason that this matters is female prisoners, the Bureau of Justice Statistics has consistently found that female prisoners are more likely to have mental illness while incarcerated than male prisoners. That's something that they've been finding consistently. Now, what's also unique, and this is a recent issue, some of you may know this if you took the incarceration class with me, the fastest growing group of individuals incarcerated are women. Now, we're going to look at that data in a little bit. However, this is going to be important for understanding how this was already an issue and how it's going to be a growing issue. So you can see that sub data point that in 2016 nationally, about 75% of women in state prisons were found to have a diagnosable mental illness, whereas only about 55% for men. So once again, a higher likelihood of women to have mental health issues. This is also a unique reality when we look at, so criminologists that do research on pathways to incarceration, they typically look at like what leads somebody to the point where they commit a crime that results in incarceration. We've talked about in class before where, if you've harmed somebody, typically, not always, but typically you dealt with harm in your past as well. Majority of our incarcerated populations are former victims themselves. But as we talked about in the last class, our system is very binary. You're either victim or offender, and we often don't leave space to recognize that individuals labeled currently as offenders because they're incarcerated may have been victims themselves. And this is going to matter a lot when we talk about any kind of mental health treatment that has to occur in carceral facilities. But particularly women who are incarcerated are more likely to have experienced trauma and abuse in their past than men who are incarcerated. They're more likely to have dealt with physical abuse, sexual abuse, substance abuse problems. All that is going to matter, especially if you are designing a treatment plan and coming up with how to address the underlying mental illness that led to the incarceration in the first place. We've talked about this a lot within the co-occurring disorders realm, but also within this. So, we've talked before in this class about how it's really important that any kind of these therapies, any of these approaches be trauma informed. And that's because many of the individuals who are getting treatment have gone through past trauma. And so any kind of attempt to address root causes of mental health must recognize its connection to trauma and recognize those two things are usually linked together and connected to the mental illness themselves. So that is really, really important. Now, when we talk about, those pathways to incarceration, there's really good research. Some of you have done it in my other class where we read Meta Chesney-Lynn's work, but we look at how women themselves can actually be criminalized for defending themselves, especially when it comes to things like domestic abuse and domestic violence. But also this happens within realms such as the illicit sex industry, where women often that are working in that industry, they were either runaways or were abused in their home when they were younger, and their ability to, when they escaped, their ability to make a livelihood and survive can actually result in their criminalization and result in them being incarcerated. And so if you're somebody that's, if you're one of these women who's incarcerated and you have a mental health issue and also a history of abuse, incarceration itself becomes another form of abuse and another thing that exacerbates the mental health issues that you're dealing with. And we found consistently, this is across men and women that are incarcerated, that if you are incarcerated with mental health issues, the symptoms of your mental health issues typically get worse. What's also important in this space that we haven't talked about before is parents who are incarcerated. I think I've told you all, I do a lot of work in looking at, in the reentry space, and understanding formerly incarcerated parents, the impact that incarceration and separation had on their children, on their relationships with their children, on their own mental health. And this matters a lot, especially with mothers who lose custody of their children while incarcerated. This becomes a burden that can either, one, it makes incarceration more difficult, right? If you've lost custody of your child. But it can also be extremely difficult to regain custody of your child. For example, in a lot of states, you'll have to pay all your criminal justice fines and fees back before you can even be considered for getting parental rights back. And also, for certain states, they actually, any kind of fees that comes to parents, that typically would exist for separated parents out of carceral facilities, those don't actually stop while incarcerated. Those fees that you owe that try to essentially keep paying for your child's livelihood and well-being those costs continue to accrue while incarcerated. And in many states, that becomes an impossible financial burden for mothers to ever overcome, which makes the ability for them to regain custody of their children nearly impossible. We also have talked about how there's structural reasons why it is harder to be incarcerated as a parent, especially a parent that's dealing with mental health issues. As we talked about recently, and some of you have studied a lot in my other classes, the reason that the average distance between prisons and major metropolitan areas where most inmates are coming from, the reason that that distance tends to be pretty far in states like Virginia and states like New York is because of structural decisions made during the prison boom decades. So when the tough on crime era was happening, prisons were popping up all over around the country because more and more people were being funneled into carceral facilities. Most of those prisons were built in rural areas who were looking for economic relief and a source of economic viability at a time when deindustrialization and globalization were happening. And so what essentially these small localities that pushed for the building of prisons, they got their consistent economy in terms of correctional officer salaries, prison warden salaries. The prisons are referred to as recession proof in terms of prisons keep on operating no matter how good or how bad the economy is. But what that did for individuals going through the system is it created longer distances of separation between parents and children or just from family members. And so that can make visitation difficult, if not nearly impossible for families. For example, let's say you're incarcerated 5 hours away from your loved ones. That means during one day a week, if you're going to come visit, you spend 5 hours traveling. You get a small window of time with your loved one. Most prisons, that's non-contact. There's no hugging. You also have to go through many of the same search processes that individuals incarcerated do in carceral facilities. And then you're driving 5 hours back. So it's a whole day. And that's assuming you actually have access to transportation to get to and from. And so for many parents, and especially what the research has found is worse for mothers, this often makes their mental health worse during that time period because not only are they dealing with the oppressive nature of incarceration, not only are they dealing with settings that make mental health symptoms worse, but that separation from their child, the lack of visitation, the inability to actually hold and touch and hug their child can be devastating and can make unique challenges. Now, both mothers and fathers can deal with this. However, we tend to find that this burden is disproportionately felt by mothers, especially what we've been finding in some of my own qualitative research is that when this separation occurs, when there's an incarcerated parent, if the incarcerated parent is the father, it's more likely that the mother steps up in terms of full custody of the child, or just keeping that child in the home. Whereas that becomes more hit or miss when the mother's incarcerated. But that's not consistent across families. But that tends to be what's consistent, what's found in the qualitative literature on this. Now, when looking at our incarcerated populations, as I mentioned before, the rate of women that are incarcerated has been growing. The reason that matters and it's important, clearly because more women are going to prison and jails. However, that also matters because we're at a time in which our incarceration rates are finally leveling off and going down a little bit. But at the same time, our overall incarceration rates are going down. The rate of women who are incarcerated is actually going up. Now, there's research being done into why this is. So that's important. Also notice the high proportion of women who are incarcerated in local jails as opposed to state prisons and federal prisons. That matters a lot because if we were to look at the overall incarcerated population, majority of incarcerated citizens are incarcerated in state prisons, not local jails or federal prisons. However, for women, they're more likely than men to be in local jails. This matters on a couple fronts. One, If you're in a local jail, if you've been found, or a regional jail, if you have a guilty conviction, that typically for a sentence a year or less, or majority of individuals incarcerated in local jails have not been convicted of a crime yet, and they are sitting there pre-trial, or what often turns out to be pre-plea deal. And so that matters a lot. So now these unique challenges we're seeing that is growing, but also growing disproportionately in local jails, many of which are less funded and less capable of handling the complex mental health issues that are coming into those facilities. You can also see between jails and prisons the disproportionate rate of female versus male offenders that have mental health problems. And this came from the Prison Policy Initiative, but they were using BJS statistics. And so this is in 2011, 2012. You can see in jail populations, about 68% of female inmates in jails reported having mental health issues compared to 41% of males. And looking in prison, 66% of females versus 35% of males. So once again, that disproportionate rate continues to occur. Now, in Thursday's class, we'll review this because this is important, especially for understanding where the future of mental health and mental illness in carceral facilities is going. It's important to recognize this trend and kind of vet out what may be some various externalities that come from it. But what I want you to also do today is in your email that I'm sending with this link to the video, I've also included 2 readings for you to do. And those 2 readings are going to look at, first off, Supreme Court cases that have that have set the standard for when can medication be either forcefully or coercively used on incarcerated populations. And so first you'll read that. So some of you have asked, because we have a long, ugly history of either voluntarily testing medication on incarcerated populations or forcing them or coercing them to take medication. And especially in the mental health sphere, that's going to be really, really important for understanding what are the legal precedents, what is legally allowed. But we're going to actually look at a modern case that just happened here recently in Arkansas when looking on some experimental treatments for COVID-19, ones that are not, FDA authorized, but that was going on among Arkansas inmates. And so this is where you can see the historical evolution of this, but also where it's happening today. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this, because this isn't always necessarily directly related to mental health, but clearly it's going to impact the mental health sphere a lot. So I want you all to do these readings either today or tomorrow. And then on Thursday's class, you're going to get in small groups, and we're going to talk as a class, one, reviewing these readings, but understanding how these evolving Supreme Court statutes, our Supreme Court's precedents, but also these recent incidents involving COVID-19 medication, how that is going to impact the intersection of mental illness and incarcerated populations. So we're going to do that first thing on Thursday. And then we also are probably on Thursday, depending on how long this goes, we will either get into this learning, or we're going to start a documentary by PBS that was really well done called Bedlam, looking at overall mental health treatment in the country, but also focusing in on treatment in carceral facilities in the Los Angeles area. And so for Thursday's class, plan for review of this material I just went over, tying up this activity on forced and coercive use of medication in carceral settings, and then kind of reviewing everything we've talked about issues in carceral facilities around mental health treatment. Okay, that is everything for now. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I plan on seeing you all during a normal class session on Thursday.